Welcome, Alejandro de la Fuente. We are so delighted to have you as a guest on Conversatorio Cubano because it has been, well, it's been a long time coming. And this is a particularly important moment for Cuban studies as a field. We want to start by asking you about the 11, almost 12 years that you served as editor-in-chief and director of Cuban Studies, the journal, which has now, accomplished another year of publication, but it has been in publication for 51 years. It's the premier journal for the study of Cuba across all fields. So given that, really important question that I think a lot of us want to ask you is, when you took over the journal, what were your goals? And have you seen those goals change over the course of the decade plus that you have been directing it?
It's good to see you, Lily, and it's great to be sort of thinking together about Cuban studies and about the journal and its life, its current life, its future lives. I really think it's very important to think about the future of the journal. When I took over the journal back in 2013, frankly, the main goal was survival. It was simply to really keep the journal alive. The journal was going through a very difficult moment, which you probably recall. The last issue that Lou Perez published, editor, was issue 40, was Cuban Studies Volume 40. That was in 2010. And after that, there were two volumes, 41 and 42, which were done by guest editors. Basically, the journal did not have a stable editor anymore. In 2010, the University of Pittsburgh Press approached me to edit the journal. At that moment, I said that I could not take it on because I was editing Hispanic American Historical Review. And I just simply thought that I didn't have the bandwidth to take another journal and do justice to another journal. I didn't realize at the time how critical the situation was. I did tell them that I would eventually do it, that they just needed to wait a few years until I finished my editorship with Hispanic American Historical Review. So by 2013, we talked again. At that moment, the journal was basically on a kind of dying trajectory. I think that's an accurate description because no volume had been published since 2011. If you look at the publication, there is a gap between volume 42, which is 2011, and volume 43, which actually came out in 2015. It was finished. We finished it together in 2014. But it took a year, as usual, for Cuban Studies to appear, so it didn't come up until 2015. So we have a gap of about 4 years. And I felt that it was something of a duty, frankly, for our generation to give continuity to this incredible editorial project that Carmelo Mesalago and his collaborators had launched back in the 70s, which had become really a beacon of plural debate about different themes in Cuban studies for decades. It was a space where very different voices with very different views participated and contributed. And therefore, I felt that we had to find a way to keep this journal alive and to take the journal back to its glory years, which to me was basically the 1980s and 1990s, when the journal was very much a presence in our intellectual lives. So that was the initial goal. The initial goal was basically a rescue operation, and the mission was to keep it afloat and to bring it back to its, to sort of revitalize the journal. There was something of there were people saying at the time that perhaps the problem was that the field was just not vibrant enough anymore. The Cuban Revolution was not as sexy as it had once been. Cuba was not as catchy. It was not anymore kind of the paradigm to many people on the so-called left. Um, and therefore, there was this idea that perhaps the journal didn't really serve a purpose anymore. My goodness, were those conversations wrong? I had the impression, just by attending the CRE conference at FIU and by just being in touch with some of the junior colleagues, that actually there was quite a bit of production. And I think we discovered that immediately. The volume 43 had 249 pages. Volume 44 had 417. We began to receive a massive number of submissions. But the most interesting thing, back in when we reached issue 50, I looked at the numbers. And at that point, we had published, excluding volume 48, which is a kind of a topical volume dedicated to the Afro-Cuban movement. Excluding issue 48, we had published about 110 authors. Yeah. Half of them, 54, so almost precisely and exactly half of them were women. And 2/3 of them had completed their PhD or were in the process of completing their PhD since the year 2010. In other words, a very young cohort of scholars who were in many cases publishing their first works in Cuban studies. So along the way, I think we were able to move from survival to nurturing and to promoting and to encouraging and to supporting. And many of those authors, first-time authors, would send papers that needed a lot of work. And I think that's where our editorial board did a great job, which was kind of taking the time to work with those authors to make their papers as good as possible, and to therefore Cuban Studies became the journal for them to share their scholarship. So, it was a very interesting process. Lisandro Perez always spoke about the change in the cover. He said that was the main important change here, Alejandro. And I think I understand why. I mean, we also changed the kind of the look of the journal. We began to have a presence within Cuba. I mean, El Toque published reviews of Cuban studies for a few years. I thought that was very important, that people would sort of learn. I think there is much more to do on that front, however. But I think if you want to kind of think of our editorial arc, we went from survival to prosperity, and now the challenges are different. The goals are different, but the possibilities are also different. It's not a question of survival anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there's a lot of ambition that we have achieved as just a general sense of where the journal needs to go, and the field itself has, among its many participants, a lot of people who left Cuba precisely because they have goals themselves that otherwise would not be fulfilled. And so we're seeing that playing out in, these folks doing doctorates, repeating careers, and participating in the journal, and doing so from positions of authority because they published, long before they ever arrived in the United States. That, I think, is a testament to what you have achieved.
One of the things that changed, as you know, is that the sort of the old Cuban studies worked on the notion of people from here and there, from scholars in the U.S., scholars in Cuba, to promote dialogue. That model, of course, is no longer useful. In the sense that the Cuban academia is fully transnational now, and many of the people who published with us are people who are working and doing their PhDs or working at universities in Latin America, Europe, Canada, and the United States, and Cuba, of course. And in many cases are people who were very difficult to kind of pinpoint because they would move around quite a bit. So, it's a very different landscape. also in that sense.
So speaking of that, particularly the concerns of this new transnational academia, what do you think are the major themes that concern Cuban scholars, or scholars of Cuba is a better way of putting it, today? And because you're a historian, I want to ask you how you think the historiography of Cuba has changed in the last 20 years. I think 20 years is a good map from which to draw. So again, the major themes that are of concern to scholars of Cuba today, wherever they may be, and then how would you describe the changes in the historiography of Cuba in the last 2 decades?
You know, one of the when we did our meeting at the Cuba Research Institute, when we did the transfer of the editorial group, you may recall that I sort of pull up all the kind of different dossiers that we had published over the years, about 20 of them or so. And it's very interesting to look at the thematic, at the themes of those dossiers and how they moved from, from issue 43 to issue 54, which is the last one I edited as editor. And what you have is a combination, of things that are obviously pressing issues in Cuban life and Cuban society. So the very first dossier we published in Cuban Studies, Cuban Studies 43, was a dossier on aging and demographic problems.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, one of the enormous challenges that Cuba faces. That challenge, if anything, has deepened in the last 10 years. Cuba is older now. Younger people are leaving the country in droves, and this is creating an impossible demographic structure. So you have dossiers like those. In one of the issues, we published 2 dossiers on urbanism and urban decay, because in some ways that Tuguria that Antonio Jose Ponte once imagined is already a reality. And, the Cuban cities are crumbling down, and people are now writing about things like this. It's very interesting. You talk about historiography. One of the dossiers that we published was a dossier on the history of public health. And of course, this is another pressing issue if you think about it, because the Cuban public health system has collapsed in the last few years. But it was once a very competent and capable public health system, not only after the revolution, but as these historians tell us, also before 1959. I was one of the perhaps, or 2 of the most interesting and timely dossiers that we published. One of them was on feminism and gendered violence. These are themes that were absent from Cuban studies years ago. But this new generation of scholars, many of whom are female scholars, are putting also new themes and new sensibilities and new research questions on the table. And then I always say we did a dossier on Cuban constitutionalism before the constitutional reform. In other words, scholars were thinking about this and were thinking about the need to reform the Constitution before the actual reform took place. So if you look at this kind of inventory, of this menu of dossiers, you are going to get a sense of what are some of the themes that are seizing the imagination of different generations of scholars right now. To me, the most exciting, in terms of historiography, the most exciting historiography is a historiography that has complicated enormously the so-called 1959 divide, and is now looking at Cuba using other chronologies, other temporalities, in which issues of persistence, previously unacknowledged continuities and possibilities emerge. I think that scholarship. We published a dossier on new kind of cultural and social histories of the revolution. Many of them actually sort of crossed that divide in order to make sense of what happened after 1959. So 1959 has receded, I think, in that most recent scholarship. And there are many authors who are now using other temporal references to understand Cuban society and Cuban politics.
I wonder, you brought up, and as a final question, I think this is very appropriate. You brought up the fact that in the early 2000s, well, by 2010, certainly, when you were asked to take over the journal for the first time, it was clear to some people that Cuba's place in the paradigm of the history of Latin America had shifted. And take it to an extreme, that argument reduces the need to study Cuba. And I certainly have received precisely that critique many times over the course of the last 24 years, which is a span of my career after I finished my dissertation. So I wonder, I wonder how you respond to the question of why Cuba matters. And when I ask that, I mean it in terms of how others on that extreme might phrase that question. So to be clear, how does Cuba matter compared to other countries of Latin America? For example, Mexico or Argentina or Brazil. I mean, after all, Cuba is so small. Why should we care?
So how many hours do you have?
I love that response.
So I would never, as a historian or as an intellectual, I would never reduce the importance of studying Cuba to 1959 or to the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was tremendously relevant way before that, and it has stayed relevant in some ways despite that, and sometimes because of that. But if you think of the colonial world and colonial history, you mentioned Mexico. You do remember where Hernan Cortés left from in order to go to Mexico, right? The sort of centrality of Cuba and of Havana, especially in Latin American history, is a centrality with colonial roots and with colonial frames of understanding. I wrote a book about this. I wrote a book about the centrality of Havana in the Atlantic world in the 16th century and the 17th centuries. This was the only place in the Americas, the one and only place in the Americas where the two main fleets of the Spanish Empire came together in order to sustain and finance that empire. That centrality persisted through the whole colonial period. And then if you think about it, Cuba, the process of nation making in Cuba is incredibly interesting and important to other countries in order to understand the sort of broader map of nation making in Latin America. Because in Cuba, the construction of an independent nation on the basis of these ideologies of racial fraternity and racial inclusion happens at the most inconvenient time. Cuba becomes a nation at the very height of scientific racism. Therefore, Cuban ideologues and Cuban patriots have to produce that ideology against the leading science of the North Atlantic. And that, I think, is a very important process to understand not only Cuba, but other cases in Latin America, such as Brazil. It's difficult to imagine two countries that have historical trajectories that are similar as Cuba and Brazil, despite their differences. And those similarities, by the way, transcend 1959. The two countries in Latin America that sent really vigorous and robust delegations to FESTAC in 1977 in Lagos, Nigeria, were Cuba and Brazil. Brazil was a rightist dictatorship, and Cuba was supposedly a socialist country. But these two countries actually were the two that did exactly the same and had very similar kind of foreign affairs policies and takes on Africa. So that transcends 1959. And the other thing is that, can you really think Latin America without the Cuban Revolution? Can you even think about Latin America during the second half of the 20th century without the multiple shades of the Cuban Revolution, which is not only the Cuban Revolution, it's not only the Cubans trying to organize guerrilla movements all over the place. It's also, most of those movements failed, as we know, but they did have other impacts. They did have other ways, other influences, and those influences live on to this day. I mean, to many people, Cuba is still something that it hasn't been for decades, really. So in all those ways, Cuba is really a window to broader processes in Latin America. And I could go on and on this. I really could. I mean, this is not a chauvinistic thing. It's just that because of its historical trajectory, Cuba has had a central place in the region. And again, that central place is not of Fidel Castro's doing. We tend to link that to just Fidel Castro. There are other historical trajectories there. There are other routes. There are other ways to think about this.
I want to say that just to bring it back to your point about Hernán Cortés and the many ways in which we are connected, there is also a kind of Guayama phenomenon where once you're Cuban, you're always Cuban. It's really hard to stop being Cuban. When Hernán Cortés left Cuba, he took one of my ancestors, who was one of my great-great-grandfathers, and Diego Sotolongo from Trinidad. And that guy went, did horrible things in Mexico. And then he went back to Cuba. He didn't stay in Mexico. So to me, when I found that out, which was many years ago, it changed everything for me, because I had always thought that, we had no history, that I had no history as the child of exiles. So Cuba surprises, Cuba continues to surprise. And then the multiple ways in which Cuba is central to the forces that developed Latin America, and to the conversations that created ideas that were very powerful in Latin America, including anti-racism and freedom, etc. We could go, as you say, we could go on and on. Well, I hope we get another opportunity to do that. Thank you so much, Alejandro, for joining us and for contributing your time and your voice and your knowledge on all of these subjects.
Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.